In this video, I wanted to try to demystify something that I get asked a lot, specifically with respect to preparing mixes. Like, what do you give a mixing engineer? Okay, so first off, full disclaimer, this differs greatly, in my opinion, even though it shouldn't. This differs greatly if the mixing engineer that you're working with is working in the same DAW as you. What do I mean by this? Well, if you're working in Studio One and your mixing engineer is working in Studio One, then just send them the session. But on the same token, they might not need to see a bunch of regions that you had in there or layers that you had in there and things that you've muted or tracks that you decided not to use or virtual instruments to things that were like you need to clean up the session for sure. But this obviously has a big difference. If I have the session and let's say that you have a bunch of different percussion tracks and you've already sent all the percussion tracks to a percussion bus and you've panned things out a little bit, then that works for me. And maybe you have a little bit of EQ on the individual source tracks, or maybe you have something on the bus, then that's fine because I have access to that. But if you had, let's say, 90 different tracks of percussion or effects, then it might be nice to actually streamline that and make some commitments, especially if you've done sound design and added reverbs and delays and things like that, and actually make some decisions and fold that down into like a stereo print that you can work with. Now, if you're working in a different DAW than the mixing engineer is, this obviously becomes a different thing because your production, you might have done it in Logic, you might have done it in FL Studio, maybe it's Ableton Live, maybe it's a mix between a bunch of different things. Maybe it was a collaborative project where everybody was working in different DAWs and they were exchanging multi-track, raw mono regions and certain stems, and maybe you have some that they gave you unprocessed and some processed. So I feel like it's a good thing to simplify a session, though, before it comes time to mix. But there's essentially a couple different ways that we can think about this with respect to when we're delivering something to a mix engineer. Now, I'm going to give you an example. More and more, I'm so happy to say that lots of the songs that come into me, they're coming in Studio One. People are doing them in Studio One. So a lot of the time, I may have, I don't use Zoom anymore, I use SessionWire, but I'll hop on a SessionWire call with them and I'll ask them to open up their session and I'll take a peek at things, especially if I say I don't have that virtual instrument or there's no need for me to get a mixing session where something is in a virtual instrument. I want it to be rendered and printed or transformed to audio. Those types of things are a given. But sometimes you have things that are where the artist has, or the producer, which can sometimes be the same person, has done a lot of work. And they don't need to do a ton of things to basically unwind their work and give it back to you in a really dry state where you would have to be kind of like searching for a needle in a haystack to try to determine exactly what did they use to recreate, to create this vibe that they were really happy with, and they've heard it that way for a certain amount of time. So this video is all about kind of like identifying that philosophy, right? And this particular track is a really good example of something that came to me in a couple different ways. This came to me in a session, but the artist had worked with somebody collaboratively, and whoever it was that had done the recording had sent her back some things, and it's just a really good example. So for example, here we have something that's a bass. I did a ton of work to this bass. This was just a stereo track. Then when it came to me, it sounded very, very simple. It sounded like this. And then I just messed it up and I gave it a completely different vibe. Now for things like the actual drums, here's a kick drum. This is a mono region. This is another mono region. There's a snare. There's a bottom mic. Here's a hi-hat. Here's a room. Everything was mono tracks. Now we have some cymbals. These were mono tracks. We have some different percussion. All of the percussion over here is going to be mono audio regions. And then the keys. This is where a lot of work was done. So there's pre-processing that's been done over here. This one. Here. And these ones. So this has all been printed and rendered, and in some cases like flattened down. And then we have the same thing for vocals. We have some of these vocals over here which are stereo, and they have actual effects that have been applied.
We find ourselves in space and time. I see you right.
So I've added some delays and some additional spatial like effects to this, but you have to be kind of like really decisive, because if you've done a lot of work on your production or anything like that, then you don't need to unwind that. So in some cases, this is the answer. In some cases, you want it to be raw mono regions. In other cases, if you're perfectly happy with everything, you can export stems. And you can export stems in different ways. You can export stems through channels. You can export stems through tracks. You can export stems so that, for example, if you have a vocal and you're sending that vocal to a reverb and delays, that if you use the export stems option and you use tracks, that it will actually bring in everything that encompass that sound. Whereas if you use channels, then it's just exporting the individual channels from the actual console. Now, I'm not going to get into all of those explanations. I am going to link to what I consider to be at least my definitive guide to exporting stems in Studio One, and it hasn't changed since I did this video. It's one of my most popular videos. I'll make sure I leave a link to that in the description above and an info card in the description below as well. But what I'm trying to say is that in some cases, if you've done a lot of work and you're completely happy with something and you want to render it down, then think about, if you thought about it in a logical way, where if you have your console and you send everything to a bus, if you're completely happy with that sound in general, maybe it's a mix down of a bunch of different strings, and you're happy with that, then you could send a submix of all those strings as a stem. I'm not going to get into like the clear black and white definitions of stems, because there's lots of differing opinions, and depending on whether you're working in the post-production industry or doing music for scores or things like that, people can have different definitions of things, right? But the way I see things, for example, like I see like multi-track audio regions or multi-track raw mono regions would be something like this, right? This is a mono region, this one over here. Let me take off the reverb for a sec. So that's just a microphone pointed at a source. Same thing over here with this one. That's just a mono audio region, okay? I've applied a lot of effects to it. That's how it sounded before. And then after I did the mix, this is what I ended up doing to it. But in these cases, it's good to give a mixer the control so that they can have the ability to maybe adjust the transients, adjust the EQ, adjust the compression, things like that. Now, I'll give you another example. If you were doing some pre-mixing or some production, let's say that you were just really happy with your drum sound. So here's all my drums, which are mono regions, which each have a little bit of something, or at the very least, they definitely would have something, some type of processing that I want. But in this case, this is what's happening to them. Let me just make sure this is isolated. Okay. So these are going, everything is hitting a compressor a little bit. And then also I'm going into a splitter and I'm hitting another compressor in parallel, but I'm smacking the hell out of it. And then it's going into Pro Q3, a little bit of dynamic processing here, and a little bit of EQ. Now, in the context of this particular song, or if you were doing production and you were really happy with that, let's say that you were completely happy with this drum sound. Right? And then in context of the whole entire mix, you said to yourself, that sounds great. In that case then, you could go song, you could go to export stems. I like to use channels. I'll select none to start off with. I could just export the drums just as a stereo print. I wouldn't see this any different as being as if though I had a drum loop, which was a stereo print that had a really cool sound and I liked the vibe of it, and I mixed it into the track at a certain level and it just sounded right, then you could do that. It's really up to you. But essentially, like I said, there's a couple different ways to think about it. When you have stuff where you're committed to it and it sounds a very specific way and you like the vibe of it and everything like that, and like, for example, these vocals over here.
We're on a journey of now.
So this stuff, any delay, any pan automation, it came to me that way. I'm doing a little bit of EQ over here and a little bit of de-essing, and then I'm doing a lot of stuff on the actual vocal bus. But in those cases, it's perfectly fine for that to be a stereo track. In this particular case,
I see your rags to be right here.
that is just a mono audio track, okay? And in that case, I'm giving it a little bit of a de-esser, and then it's going to a bus, and all of these vocals are basically sending out to reverbs and delays and choruses and wideners and stuff like that from the actual bus channel. But it was good that I had the actual mono regions over here, because each one of these benefited from having a de-esser be applied. But then the other ones where you have a very cool stereo effect or something like that, and there's effects that have been printed in, and they've been actually done vocal production, or maybe hard tuning, or added octaves or artificial things, or some type of vocal processing. Those should be stems, especially if you've done it that way, because when you give it to a mixer, the start of this should be the vision of the song. Like if I go to the rough, let me find a good place. Let me go, where is it here? Let me go here. So now if I solo the rough that came to me, so that's the rough that came to me, and then if I come out of the rough and I play mine, the song should sound like the song when I open it up. And if you've done anything where your rough mix has a bunch of things that have been done, where you applied a bunch of different effects, saturation, chorus, width, loudness stuff, parallel compression, and then you send off the mono regions totally dry, totally unaffected to somebody, they're going to have a hard time. They're going to be really fighting a losing battle to try to come close to your rough, because we're not necessarily hired to do sound design and production. I'm just hired to, balance a mix. So these are things to take into account. Like I said, I'm going to make sure that I put a link to my exporting stems, but there's also a really simple way in Studio One to export raw regions. No matter if you have a lot of stuff going on or not, if I just wanted to export an actual raw region, then it's as simple as basically click, holding, and dragging to the browser area. I could just click, hold, and drag a region, and then it will render it down. And we have the ability to do that so it's not actually applying any of the effects chains or the processing. Now, if it's something where you have multiple raw regions, like, for example, let's say that something was cut up. Let me see if I can find anything here. Yeah, like, for example, let's say that this particular track over here, this had a bunch of different regions that were cut up, and I still wanted it to be raw. I could just make a highlighted range selection and drag that actual highlighted range selection over into a folder. And then if I were to drag it, like click, hold, and drag it and into an actual folder, and I was in the Files tab, then it would basically consolidate from the beginning of my range selection to the end of my range selection. And then the only other thing that I would always say is please make sure that all your stuff starts at, bar one. Even if you have silence at the beginning of something, like let's say here, if I was to export this and if I wanted to be like saving space, then I would basically I would still make a range selection from somewhere about over here, but always make sure that it starts at bar one. But like I said, certain things, mono regions, I'll make sure I include a video. Other things, you want it to be stems. In the best case scenario, you create a streamlined, cleaned up version of your production, and you're working in the same DAW as your mixer. In the cases where you're not, you give them folders, and in that folder, you make sure your stuff is properly labeled. Some are stereo. A mixer is going to be able to see like, oh, something's mono, it's probably going to be raw. But if they see something stereo, and especially if they see something stereo and, where is it here? you can often see, here's a good example. If I can see that it not only is it stereo, but I can see that the waveform on one side is bigger, then I know that it was maybe a mono or stereo submix and that the panning was off to the right. So it's louder in the right. It sounds like it's tilting towards the right. A mixer will be able to assemble those things. But it's really, I can't answer it in a very specific way other than to say certain things raw, and then in other cases, you want them to be stems, where they're very, like if you want to bake your panning in, orchestral stuff. And then in other cases, it's going to be submixes, where maybe you just want to export a percussion submix or a drum submix. I hope this helps. This is something that took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around. And I used to always think that I could recreate everything better than a producer or an artist. If they had basically put some stuff in place, I would think, oh, I've got plugins that I can do that. You're wasting your time. Just get what they have. If there is a problem with it, give them a quick call. Hey, I need you to resend that one element. Can you back off of the delay a bit? Or maybe can you send it to me separately? Or can you separate these two things for me? Separate the high harmonies from the lows. I want to rebalance it. It's simple. It's just basic communication. Anyways, I hope this video helps. Catch you in the next one. Cheers.